So today I thought we would go over all the books I have read in 2025 so far, and I'll tell you which ones I recommend you pick up. Starting the year off strong, this is the year of the Sun Eater for this channel. We are working through the Sun Eater books, so of course we read the first book, Empire of Silence, in January, and I really enjoyed this book. It's one that is really popular right now, and everybody seems to be reading it, so I thought it would be a lot more easy to recommend. But it's one of those books that I can completely see it not working for some people. However, it worked so well for me. I loved this book. And I have heard the first book is the weakest and it only gets better, and we'll come to some of the other books in the series in a minute. But I really enjoyed the first book, so I have a feeling that this is going to be an all-time favorite series. This is a very large scope space opera series. There are a lot of books and novellas and side stories, but even just the lore and the world building in the first couple books is insane. It's so impressive how well fleshed out the world feels. This is a first-person narrative from the perspective of Hadrian Marlowe as he looks back on his life. In the prologue of this book, he's watching the devastation and explosion of a sun, or I guess implosion of a sun it would be. And that's how the story starts. Christopher is not messing about. We have a sun blowing up in the first line of this series, and it's how Hadrian then gets to that point. So we jump right back to the first moments of this story with Hadrian as I think he's like a teenager or late teenager, maybe 20 odd in this first book. And he's kind of this spoiled noble who has a very tyrannical father, this very dysfunctional family, and it's kind of his journey into becoming the Sun Eater, the destroyer of worlds. This is a very introspective book. It's very philosophical. You can see a lot of kind of the old classic philosophers and some of their ideas being weaved into this narrative and the themes around this book. The prose is beautiful to read. The pacing is a wee bit choppy, and I think that's where it will lose some people because it does have some slower moments. However, it is well worth reading even those slower moments. This is the journey that Hadrian goes on, even just in this first book, is immense, and I highly recommend reading this book. And everyone else has read it and is recommending it, so I don't think I need to badger too long about this one. It's great. It's really good. And I did do a full video review if you want to see more in-depth thoughts on Empire of Silence. Next on up, I did read A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. Now, of course, romantasy is absolutely huge. It is dominating the fantasy market, so I thought I need to at least read some romantasy. Romance is not really something that I am that interested in, even in the fantasy stories that do include it. And it's not something, I like it when it's there and it's done well, but I don't want to read a book where that's kind of the main focus. So I was a bit iffy going into A Court of Thorns and Roses. However, it was not bad. I was surprised at how dark some of the moments in the book were. It went to darker places than I thought romantasy would go. So I really enjoyed that, and also some of the world building aspects were really interesting. It felt almost video game-like with these different seasoned kingdoms. I liked that. That was really cool. I'm not a huge fan of the writing style. It reads quite young and simplistic in some places. It also seems to have a lot of modernized sections mixed in with this more fairy tale-esque description work, and the two styles don't necessarily blend for me personally. It feels really jarring to be very modern language and then jump into a section where it's very fairy tale-ish. She describes the peridot grass or something like that. It didn't really work for me, the writing style. This is another one that I did an entire video on, so if you want to see my more thorough thoughts on this book, I included a lot of my... Hell yeah, Nesta. I'm glad someone gets how useless the dad is. Not a huge fan of throat bobbing imagery. Thoughts throughout reading it, as well as like a final review wrap-up, so definitely check that video out. Next on up, I read Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. Now, this is my first Agatha Christie book, and I did not know the mystery solution. I did not know how it would resolve. A lot of people seem to know it from the film or the TV show, or just from hearing it, because this is an iconic story in literature. But I didn't, so it was really, really cool getting that twist and getting to see the resolution to the narrative. I listened to the audiobook experience where it has different cast members and also sound effects, and that was a lot of fun. It was an interesting way to read a murder mystery. It was short, it was fun. I did think some elements, we do have like the detective having this side character that he has someone to bounce ideas off of and talk with, just to kind of talk through his thought process, which you could see immediately what was happening, and some of those moments didn't feel necessarily that natural. However, this story really has style. The main character, detective, is such a fun point of view to read from, and I liked learning more about these side characters as we worked through this mystery. It was a very short book, but it was a ton of fun, and I'm definitely going to be reading more Agatha Christie. Next on up, I read Blood Over Bright Haven by M.L. Wong. And I have so many thoughts about this book. It was almost going to jump immediately into my top 10 books of all time, and just one small element kind of knocked it slightly back for me, but I still loved it so much. This is such a good book. This has really solidified Emma Wong as an auto by author. I loved Sword of Kaigen, and I loved this book so much as well. If she ever releases more, well, when she releases more books, I will be there day one. This story follows Sayona, a young girl who's trying to become the first female sorcerer or mage. I can't remember the term used, but she's trying to be the first one to get into this academy. And there's not really a spoiler that she gets in. It's kind of, it happens right at the start of the story, and I'm pretty sure it's in the synopsis as well. And what M.L. Wong does with her character and her arc throughout the book is equally some of the best character work I have ever read, mixed with a slight section in the middle that I didn't really like. It's so weird because I was obsessed with this book. For the first 60%, I thought, I'm enjoying every single second, and this might be one of my top books of all time forever. I loved it that much. And then there is this one chapter around the 60% mark that has this conversation where it just kind of batters down some of these themes, and it feels quite heavy-handed, and it feels a wee bit too much. I think if it just reeled back a little bit in that section, this could easily have been one of my favorite books of all time. And again, if that's my only complaint and it could have been a favorite of all time, it shows you how much I did enjoy this book despite that. I loved this book. It was awesome. I just wish didn't have that bit, and then it would be perfect. This is one that I recommend you don't read too much into, so don't go watch a ton of reviews on it. I do recommend you just try this book. I think the majority of people will love this, and there seems to be a large portion of people who are absolutely obsessed with it. And I am in that percentage of obsessionness because, oh man, Blood Over Bright Haven I thought was going to be good, but it really did blow my socks off. This might be my favorite read of the year so far. That's how much I enjoyed this book. It really delves into a lot of mental health, so there could be some content warnings. I do recommend maybe looking that up if you're bothered by that sort of thing, because it does definitely lean into very heavy topics with Sayona. However, it was done so well for the most part. Again, there's maybe one or two sections that didn't quite jive with me completely, but it was worth it. It was such a good book. Also, if you like audiobooks, the audiobook narrator is Moira Quirk, who's one of my favorite audiobook narrators of all time. So she absolutely killed it with this. Such a good audiobook. So if you like audiobooks, highly recommend. Next on up, I read Shroud by Adrian Tchaikovsky, and this one surprised me with how good it is. And it surprised me that not more people are talking about this book. It is so good. So Shroud is about this research team that are looking at this planet that they have named Shroud. It is a moon that is covered in this thick layer of darkness, and they're trying to study it and see what's happening on that planet. However, let me just make sure it does tell you this in the... It does. It tells you in the synopsis, there's a catastrophic accident that forces two of the main characters down onto the surface of Shroud. And they're trying to understand this very strange, high-pressure, very dangerous planet and some of its inhabitants, we shall say. I don't even know where to begin with this book, because one of the reasons that I loved it so much is that so many different elements were done incredibly well. So some of the other books I'm going to highlight, I talk about these huge highs that I loved this, but this didn't really work for me. Shroud was just incredible across the board. every single element to the story, apart from one minor gripe I have, I adored it. It was so well done. It really highlights Adrian Tchaikovsky's skills as a writer because the characters were well developed, the plot was fascinating, the sort of science elements and this planet was very interesting, the pacing was good, the plot was good, the ending was fantastic. Again, just across the board, Shroud was awesome. So of course, at the start of the book, we do start in this research team above the planet, kind of looking down and studying it. But the majority of the book does take place on Shroud. However, I'm really impressed with the amount of work that Adrian put into kind of crafting the world and also the characters and this research team. It does a really, really good job of this very unusual lifestyle that this research team and the humans in this world have. If they are important and they are needed, they are brought out of this hibernation and they're used on these teams. Whereas if they do very poorly, they can be put back under this hibernation. And they don't really want that to happen because they're kind of knocked out completely and don't dream or anything like that. It's just complete blackness. And Adrian does a really good job of adding the human element to that. You can really see how that affects society and how it affects camaraderie, because you might not wake up at the same time as your friend. You might be hundreds of years apart. They might have retired. You might wake up and not ever see anyone that you'd seen in the past before. So of course, that's going to majorly affect working in a research team like this. You don't really want to get too close to people. And despite the fact that this wasn't a major part of the story, Adrian did a fantastic job of really making you feel for these people and this lifestyle, and how that really affects the people who crash land on Shroud and kind of their dynamics, and how the stress of a situation like that can bring some people together, but also create some friction because of this kind of dynamic. It's fascinating just to see how he played with the human relationships in this very sort of unique setting, despite the fact that it wasn't the main focus of the narrative. And as for Shroud itself, it is fascinating. So Shroud is one of these things that I sometimes struggle with. It jumps between the main character's perspective, but also an alien like perspective of one of the inhabitants of Shroud. And I really like, from a stand back approach, from a narrative perspective, how interesting that could be. It's really cool to kind of get into the head of a demon or someone who has a completely different outlook on life. But sometimes I struggle with it because it's very hard to then relate to the character. It's very hard to empathize and really get into their narrative. But what Adrian does really well with this is you learn more about the planet, more about what is happening in the plot by following this alien perspective, because of course what they see going on is completely different from what the people see going on. And this dual perspective, getting to see something happen from the human's perspective, then jumping chapter and seeing it from the alien's perspective, and it's completely different, is fascinating. And also being in this alien perspective and learning more about Shroud and the planet is very, very different from what I thought it was going to be. It's not just very typical boring aliens. There's a lot of thought put into the science and the life that live on such a unique planet atmosphere. It's so good. Go read this book. My one gripe is something that sits about the 80% mark, and I can't really talk about without getting into spoilers, but it just felt like a large part of the narrative was resolved very easily, and I would have liked to have seen more issues arise at that kind of last hurdle before they overcame this one element of the story. It got into the finale after that, and the finale was incredible, so it made up for it, but I did find that just little conversion into Act 3 a bit quick for me personally. And the ending really surprised me. There was so much to the ending that I absolutely loved, and that sort of last part, that last chapter, oh, it was such a good book. Highly, highly recommend checking out Shroud. And of course, we hopped back into Sun Eater after that with Howling Dark, book 2, and it's even better than book 1. What I will say is I think the start is quite rough. I did find the opening to Empire of Silence to be pretty slow, but I did think even Howling Dark was a lot more slow. You're very much thrown in the deep end with Howling Dark. And Christopher spends a lot of the start of this book kind of catching you up on the events that happened in between book 1 and book 2. as there's a huge time skip between the two. However, once it got going, it got going. There was a scene early on that I really enjoyed, and that brought me right back into the narrative. Like I said with the first book, Christopher does a really good job of building up the world building, but also tying that world building to the narrative. There was elements in book 1 that were just kind of dropped as lore and information of how the world got to the point it is at and why we don't have a lot of AI, things like that. And I didn't know if that was just going to be background knowledge to why there aren't a ton of AI in the world, or if it was going to directly impact the story. But it does impact the story, and those elements I loved so much. So much of this book I think is an improvement over the first book. I think the character work with Hadrian's even better than in book 1. I think the plot is a lot more interesting than book 1. It's also a lot more concise in sort of a book format. The first book is very broken up into small segments, whereas this one feels like sort of one cohesive narrative within a book, one leg of his journey, if you will. I think the action scenes are better than book 1, and Christopher is still an incredible writer, and the prose style is just fantastic. I did also read The Lesser Devil, the novella in between book 1 and 2 that follows Crispin, Hadrian's brother, when he's a lot older. What I will say is this was not really required reading. It is a side story to the main narrative and main books. But I did really like getting more of Crispin. He wasn't really a character that I was that interested in to learning more about after Empire of Silence. However, I think Christopher did a fantastic job of making him a lot more interesting a character. I think Christopher really has a strength in point of view characters. The ones that we are in the head of, he does a really good job of fleshing them out. You can see how Crispin's is very arrogant, pretentious, noble, but also how he kind of has a little bit of self-awareness. He knows he's a bit arrogant. And kind of that self-awareness wasn't something that I expected to see from Crispin. So getting into his head and seeing him more as a human and not this archetypal younger brother was fantastic. Really fleshed out the Marlowe family and a lot more of the information around that part of the lore. We did also get a lot of interesting world building, especially to do with how Earth is kind of long gone. They abandoned it, they damaged it to the point of no return. And it's interesting to see what elements have survived since those times. There are some religions that have survived. There are also religions that have been adapted from those original religions. Also some lifestyles and some fragments of languages. Christopher really has put a lot of thinking into the world building and lore, and that's really shown off in this novella. So you don't need to read it, but it is a fun side story. I also not only read, but I also wrote the last book on this list, and that is The Black Mantle, the second book in the Shadowbinders trilogy. I published this in February, so a lot of my January and into February was going over this book, and I'm so proud of it. This second book really scales up the narrative. You get a lot more of the political maneuvering and situation in the country of Taris. Also, the main character is very much Rai in this story, whereas in book 1, it focuses a lot more on Naya. However, if you enjoyed Rai's sections with Fax, the creature that lives in his shadow, there's a lot more of him and also his past, with a lot of flashback sections that kind of fleshes him out as a character. There's a ton of fun world building reveals and a lot more about the shadow magic, but also the blood magic. So if you haven't checked out this dark epic fantasy that takes inspiration from ancient Egyptian mythology, the first book is Harbinger of Justice, and the second book just published in February, which is The Black Mantle. And book 3 will be coming out next year. Let me know in the comments below, what is the best book you have read this year so far? See, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm kind of torn between Blood over Brighthaven and Shroud. The emotional highs of Blood over Brighthaven were just incredible, but Shroud was just such a complete, overall, everything was great book that I kind of want to say Shroud. So those two are kind of sitting at the top. Thank you very much for watching. Outro.